Okay, this quick lesson, forgive me while I get everything set up here. This quick lesson is about issues. What is an issue? Now, again, for this course, there are terms that are used in everyday language that um, we're not very clear about or that we use in a certain way in everyday discussions that for this class are really more specifically defined. And so the word issue or what an issue is one of those things that for this class you might find that we're defining it in a way that you maybe didn't take it to be normally. So here's the word issue. Okay, feeling compelled to clean for some reason. I don't know why. An issue really is, for the purposes of this class, nothing more than a question. So um, um, now, issues being nothing more than questions. So let me give you some examples. One issue, does God exist? Now notice I asked a question. Okay, now the question of whether or not God exists is an issue. And an issue is just, it's something to be resolved, something to be answered. So for the purposes of this class, and just to keep things clear in our mind, an issue is always a question, and it can be a question about anything. If my wife comes home and I'm grumpy and she goes, "What is your problem?" She's raised an issue. She's raised a question. And her question is, what is it that's bothering you? Okay. Um, and, I can respond in various ways that I'm sure would, well, anyways. So, other issues, let's see, whether or not God exists. Should you do your homework? That's an issue. It's a question. Um, should you move? Should you stay enrolled in this class? Should you read that book? Should you, should you, should you? Okay. All of these are questions. And so when you're looking at your book um, and they're talking about issues here, I want you to understand that an issue is just a question. Now, the point that they're going to make in the book, and what's a little bit, you have to now place what an issue is or where questions sit in relation to critical thinking. Whenever we make assertions, our assertions are always answers to some question. So if I assert, remember this from a previous lecture, if I assert, turn it sideways so you can see, if I assert the book cover is red, that's actually an answer to an issue. And the issue is, what color is the book cover? Okay. So for every answer we give, there's some question that it's an answer to, or some issue that it is attempting to resolve, or that it's taking a side on. Okay. So if I assert God exists, okay, then my assertion that God exists is an answer to a question. And there is an issue that that assertion is answering. Okay? Now, how do I identify, if I make an assertion, how do I identify what the issue is that that assertion is answering? It's very easy. Take that assertion and turn it into a question by just prefacing it with the phrase whether or not. So, for example, go back to the example I used. If I assert God exists, then the issue there is whether or not God exists. Okay, that's the question. So my assertion that God exists is an answer to the question, or is my answer to the issue of whether or not God exists. Okay. You should move, or um, you should buy the book for this course. Okay. Well, that is what if I assert you should buy the book. then that assertion is an answer to a question. The issue there is whether or not you should buy the book. Again, take whatever the assertion is and phrase it as a question, and that's the issue. Now, here's why this is important. Some of you will have heard the phrase that two people are talking past one another. Here's what that means. And we can actually now, I can help you make sense of what that means given what we're saying here. When two people are talking past one another, what's happening is that what they're saying in one person's case is answering a different question than the other person is answering. So the issue for person A is different than the issue for person B. They're talking about different things. They're answering different questions. And so their answers sort of bypass one another. So, for example, if I ask, let's say that you were to assert that this class is boring, and I were to say, but the class is educational, then we're actually talking past one another. Why? Well, because your issue, the issue that you have, is whether or not the class is boring. My issue was whether or not the class is informative, right? Now notice, those are two separate questions, and answering the one question doesn't really have implications for the other question. So we're not talking, the problem there is that we're not talking about the same thing. We're answering different questions. So we're literally talking past one another. But if you were to say, this class is boring, and I were to reply, no, it's not, notice that we're both answering the same question. So we're talking about the same topic. We're addressing the same issue. We're giving different answers to the same question. So then we're engaging in a dialogue. This is important because a lot of times what we find is when people are arguing, they're not really addressing each other. They're talking past one another. One person is making a point, and that point has to do with issue A, and another person is making another point, and that has to do with issue B. But they're answering different questions. Well, then they're not really intellectually connecting. They're not really exchanging ideas. They're not really having a discussion about some topic. There are two different discussions going on, each about a different topic or a different issue or a different question. So this is part of why it's important. The other reason why it's important and how it connects to the next lesson, which is about what an argument is that arguments are really attempts to answer that question, or to address, or to resolve, I should say, that issue. So we have the issue whether or not God exists. Some from that, let's put the question whether or not God exists here, right? This will be the question, whether or not God exists. And then there will be two answers, right? Yes, God exists, or no, God doesn't. Those are assertions, both having to do with the same question. So they're related. But the argument, then once you assert God doesn't exist, you then have to give an argument for it. And over here, if you say God does exist, you have to give an argument for it here. So the arguments on each side are both attempts to resolve this issue. So arguments are sort of attempts to resolve issues. And every argument, every thinking that we do, every critical thinking that we do, is really an attempt to resolve an issue. Okay? And so that's more or less why that's really important for us to understand. So what we're going to want to be able to do in this class is to be able to sort out, okay, here's the argument, okay, and then here's what's at issue. Here's the question. And then here's another argument, and this argument, what's at issue is the same thing, or what's at issue is something different. And we're going to want to be able to track that, okay? Why? Well, if you're giving an argument for something, and it's in answer to this issue over here, and another person is giving an argument over here, and it's dealing with a whole different issue, then you're not really talking about the same thing. Then your arguments are not touching. You're talking past one another. And then the points that each other makes have no impact on each other. So, but issues are just the larger questions that we ask, that arguments, which is the next lesson, are attempts to answer. So